The first thing I read in her diary wasn't the confession I expected or some tortured moral debate about lines she never meant to cross. It was a careful list of restaurants, each one chosen for the level of privacy the corner table could offer and the kind of dim light that makes faces feel safer. And next to each name, she had written tiny notes about when the waitress changed shifts and which host would seat them without questions if she smiled, and said she was on a tight lunch break. And that is when my stomach dropped, because you don't keep a logistics notebook for friendly lunches unless those lunches would end a marriage if anyone saw them. And in that moment, the sounds of our apartment sharpened. The radiator ticking like a metronome for a song I didn't want to hear, and the neighbor upstairs dragging a chair in slow circles, and the rain starting a fine, steady thread against the windows. And my hands shook so badly that I had to press the book flat with my palm just to keep the page from quivering like a trapped thing. I had not meant to find it. And I know that's a cliche because people always say they stumbled into the truth like it was a wet patch on the floor. But the truth is I was looking for packing tape because I wanted to send my mother a box of late peaches, and the drawer stuck, and the diary slid out under the scissors, small and linen-bound and more private than a locked door. And I told myself I would put it back because I had no interest in playing the villain of someone else's boundaries. But then the apartment was too quiet and the tape wasn't in the drawer, and I heard myself say, "You're not going to read it." The way you say to a kid, "You're not going to touch the stove." And the kid still does because the glow is right there and the curiosity is louder than the warning. I didn't start at the beginning, because beginnings are lies we tell ourselves about what we meant to be. I opened somewhere in the middle and there was a sentence that said, "He told me he couldn't think straight in meetings because of the way I look at him when I lean over the conference table." And I recognized the he right away because I had been to the holiday party and I had watched the way her boss hovered like an anxious moth around candles, landing on the safest flame, then backing off with a laugh that sounded like a throat trying not to swallow something it wanted too badly. There is a particular species of humiliation that doesn't arrive with shouting or broken glass and instead slips in through the seams of ordinary life. And that is what this was, because the page I read didn't say, "I cheated last night and my marriage is dying." It said, "Remember to bring a cardigan to the hotel lobby because the air conditioning is aggressive and the front desk woman with the copper hair looks through people, not at them," which is helpful. And beneath that she had sketched a tiny map of a side entrance with a keypad and a code circled in red. And suddenly our kitchen table, where I was standing with my palms flattening that book, felt like a crime scene with no blood and no weapon. Only the soft thud of my heartbeat moving through the underside of my wrists. I could have screamed, or I could have called her, or I could have put the diary back and tried to never think about the phrase aggressive air conditioning. But instead I turned the page and found the sentence that changed me from someone who suspected to someone who knew. And it was a line written on a Tuesday in her neat, careful hand. Canceled afternoon staff check-in for me and told everyone I'm taking vendor calls in the conference room. And he winked like an idiot and told the intern to run interference because she owes him for last week's scheduling mess. And I almost laughed because the entire floor is part of the romance now, which is hilarious and horrible. I had always imagined infidelity as a private act that happened in rooms with the blinds drawn and the doors latched, but I never imagined the choreography of a whole workplace lifting its shoulders to make space for the two of them to slip past, smiling with the kind of bland politeness people use when they pretend not to notice the obvious. And the thought that these people had shaken my hand at happy hour and sent her thank you notes for the cookies she baked at Christmas turned sour in my mouth like milk left in the sun. The entry kept going because my wife had always been a thorough person who organized her emotions like files and liked to make lists so that feelings didn't spill over the edges of the day. And she wrote, booked the catering room accidentally for a non-existent vendor and left the lights off. Jay offered to take any walk-ins at reception and told me not to worry if I took too long. T said he'd log my calls on the dashboard so nobody noticed the gap. I should feel ashamed, but all I felt was the relief of not carrying the secret alone. I closed the book so hard that the air lifted a corner of the grocery list on the counter, and the refrigerator hummed a little louder as if it, too, had opinions, and I stood there with my breath catching on something sharp inside my chest, and I caught sight of our photos on the opposite wall. That stupid series we took at the beach where I'm laughing like a man who thinks promises are weatherproof, and she's making a face like the wind is too cold for her ears, and for a long time the only thing I could think was that it is possible to be faithful in every day of your life and still be the biggest fool in the room. I won't pretend I didn't open the diary again because, in the absence of compassion, the second most powerful fuel is the need for certainty, and I needed the clean flame of it. So I flipped back to where the whole thing seemed to start and found an entry that said, "He told me he wanted to mentor me because he saw something in how I handled the vendor escalation, and it felt good to be seen." And I wrote that down because good things should be recorded, and I'll hate myself if this becomes something else. And if you have ever heard the floor creak under the first step into a wreck you won't be able to walk out of easily, you know the sound I heard then, not in the apartment, but in my head, and I had to sit down because my legs were suddenly empty of trust. She had not set out to wreck us, at least not in a way that would make a movie. But over the next pages the tone shifted, the way daylight shifts in a living room when a cloud passes and you don't realize until you are squinting to read. And by the time I reached the part where she described how he put his hand on her elbow as they left a meeting and the pressure felt like a question and not like a command, I knew the story was already galloping toward a cliff. There were dates, and there were hotel codes, and there were notes about which colleagues to avoid because they were gossips and which ones were safe because they were loyal to him or terrified of losing their jobs. And there were tiny, ugly jokes about office politics that read like someone trying to put a bow on a stain, and I hated that I understood why she wrote them. What hurt was not only the sex, which I could imagine in the worst possible detail because the brain hates being left out and loves to fill in missing pieces with the crudest crayons it can find, but the conspiracy of ordinary people who decided the closest thing to kindness was complicity. And I recognized names I had written on Christmas cards, and people who had come to our house and eaten casserole at our table and told us about their kids' allergies and their mortgage rates and their vacation plans. And I kept thinking about how those conversations had always felt harmless and now felt like camouflage. And I couldn't stop my mind from replaying the holiday party when the junior staffer with the symmetrical eyebrows laughed too loudly at something my wife said and glanced at the boss like she was checking his weather. And I remembered how the office manager had dragged me into a conversation about her new rescue dog just as my wife disappeared toward the service elevator. And at the time I thought, wow, people here are friendly. And now I thought, you learned to smile with your teeth while blocking the hallway with your body. I didn't confront her that night, because if you have ever held a detonator you know you don't press it just because your thumb can move. And also she was at a work dinner, which made me laugh out loud in a way that sounded like choking and made our cat jump off the chair and vanish under the sofa. And I did something petty that I refused to apologize for even to myself, which was to take a photo of the page and email it to an address I keep for receipts, because I knew that in the morning I would want to pretend I had dreamed the whole thing, and I wanted the truth to be waiting where I couldn't ignore it. The rain grew harder and then softer, and I washed the cutting board from the peaches I had been slicing before I searched the drawer for tape. And I put the diary back exactly where it had been because she is the kind of person who notices when objects shift a centimeter. And then I sat on the floor with my back to the cabinets and counted my breaths until the dizzy feeling passed. When I finally stood up, I realized I had been holding my jaw so tight that my temples throbbed. And the first thought that walked through my mind like a drunk through a glass door was that I could forgive a lot if I could see a single line in that book where she remembered me as more than a piece of furniture in her life. And the second thought followed close behind, and it was uglier. I didn't want to forgive a damned thing. I wanted to set fire to the idea that they were clever and I was blind. When she came home just before 10, she smelled like the kind of wine an expense account encourages, and she kicked off her shoes at the door and told me the dinner had dragged because the vendor wouldn't stop talking about a new logistics platform. And she rolled her eyes in a way that used to charm me and now made me feel like the ground was shifting under my feet. And she asked if I had eaten, and I said I had. And she asked if everything was okay with my mother's package, and I said I hadn't found the tape, and she apologized like people do when they are apologizing for something small, because they hope it counts toward a larger debt you don't know about yet. And the sound of her apology didn't fit the size of the hole I had just fallen through. I watched her pour herself a glass of water and stand at the sink and drink the whole thing without looking at me, the way she always does when she wants to cool her face from the inside out. And I wondered if he had memorized that habit too, or if he only knew the parts of her that could be unbuttoned. I asked her how the junior project manager was performing, because people slip when they are trying to carry too many lies, and she launched into a detailed account of a deliverable that had missed a deadline, complete with polished irritation and the kind of managerial phrases that hide more than they reveal. And she finished by saying that everyone at the office was stretched thin but pulling together. And I clicked my teeth on the inside of my mouth so hard that I tasted the iron of blood. And I said, "Must be nice to work somewhere so supportive." And she said, "They're good people. We're lucky." And I felt something in me cleave neatly down the center. I slept next to her that night like a soldier in a trench listening for the pause between shells, and sometime around 3 she rolled over and flung her arm across my chest and sighed a little, and it was the kind of unguarded sound that used to make me believe in domestic peace, the little mammal noises of a person you love settling into sleep. And I stared at the ceiling thinking about the way the diary had described the intern running interference, and I imagined her bright, nervous face, and how she must have nodded when the boss asked. And I wondered how many people had recalibrated their consciences for a paycheck that month, and I hated how much sense it made, because the rent is due and the project is late, and the boss likes you better when you are helpful. In the morning, she kissed my forehead and told me she had a long day and might be late, and I said, "Do what you have to do," in a tone that could be read as supportive or scathing, depending on the light, and she smiled absently and told me not to forget to send the peaches, and I stood at the window after she left and watched the bus arrive a minute early. And I thought about how systems move with or without your permission and how people get trapped in them whether they want to or not. And then I thought about how none of that mattered because at some point she had written a hotel code in red pen and circled it twice. I tell you all this because the hook in my chest wasn't the sex itself, which is the part movies always want you to splash around in, but the machinery around it, the colleagues who became a wall she could lean against so she wouldn't fall out of the picture, and the realization that, for months, while I walked around believing I was inside our life, I had actually been standing just outside the frame. A comfortable background object she arranged to look like stability, and that quiet cruelty was somehow worse than any dramatic betrayal I had rehearsed in my mind over the years as an exercise in catastrophic thinking. I spent the day after reading the diary moving through my tasks like a man underwater, and every time my phone buzzed I expected it to be some cosmic notification telling me I had been forced into a secondary role in a story I didn't consent to. And instead it was my bank asking me to review a charge or a friend sending a photo of his kid covered in spaghetti sauce. And the normalcy felt like an insult and like a rope I could hold on to. I didn't call anyone, because there is a shame in being wrong about the person you chose that makes your throat close, and because I didn't want the shape of this thing to be defined by anyone else's words. I wanted to decide what it meant, and I wanted to do it without being talked out of my anger. That night, I went for a walk in the rain because people make better decisions when their socks are wet, or at least that's what I told myself to justify the stubborn way I kept going even as the water crept into my shoes. And I passed the glass front of a restaurant she had listed in the diary, and I stood across the street watching the waiters move like chess pieces around the tables. And I thought about the note she had written about the booth near the kitchen and how the busser would keep his head down if you asked him to, and my jaw ached and my fingers itched, not for violence, not for any stupidity I would regret, but for something clean and precise and sharp, a plan that would acknowledge the reality we were in without embarrassing me further with theatrics. I walked until the rain softened into mist, and the city smelled like wet concrete and exhaust, and the first leaves beginning to rot. And when I got home, I toweled off and sat on the edge of the bed, and she stirred and asked, half asleep, if everything was okay, and I said, in a voice I barely recognized, that everything was exactly what it looked like, and she nodded and rolled over, and I lay down with a certainty cooling in me like steel. Here's the part you came for, I know. The moment the hook sinks all the way in and refuses to let go. I knew then that I was going to take this thing apart in the place where it lived, not in our kitchen with tears or in a hotel lobby with theatrics, but in the office ecosystem that had fed it, grown it, and protected it. And I was going to do it by moving slowly and speaking softly and being the most reasonable man anyone in that building had ever met, because the one thing people in power hate more than scandal is paperwork attached to the truth, and my wife had written down enough to show me the path. I was not going to shout or plead or flip a table, because none of that would change the math. I was going to learn the rules of their machine and then feed the machine what it couldn't digest. Dates tied to policies, names connected to procedures, codes linked to security logs, patterns that a compliance officer would salivate over. and I was going to walk it in on a leash and set it down in front of the person who had the authority to turn friendliness into fear. I could almost hear the sound of the gears grinding when the wrong kind of truth enters a system designed to ignore anything that doesn't generate revenue. And that sound was the closest thing to relief I had felt since I opened that linen-bound book and read that the copper-haired woman at the front desk looked through people instead of at them, because I promised myself I would make them look right at me, and I would do it without raising my voice. When the diary settled into my head like a splinter I could not find with tweezers, every ordinary thing she did started to read like a signal in a code I had only just learned, and the world around me shifted into a landscape of small betrayals. I found myself cataloging moments I had once admired as intimacy and now recognized as rehearsed steps in a carefully choreographed concealment. And for a week, I lived like a man with an alarm wired into his skin, each sound and glance setting off a new circuit of suspicion. I watched how she answered her phone with the exact same softening of voice that had always been for my mother, and now imagined that the soft tone was being used to smooth the edges of another man's ego. And I listened to the way she laughed at stories from her colleagues at dinner with a laugh that used to be private and affectionate, and suddenly felt public and performative. And every time she mentioned the office, I felt the syllables like a hammer tapping on the glass dome of my life until the dome cracked in a hairline, and the thing inside could not help but look out. I began to go to bed later than I had any business doing, because the quiet hours were the only place the truth didn't wear camouflage, and I started to rationalize surveillance in ways I would have mocked a year earlier, telling myself that there was nothing noble about living as a passive background in the story of your own marriage. That if she had chosen to let strangers write the footnotes to our life, then I had every right to read what she had written in the margins. The staff names leapt off the pages and into my memory like characters I had passed in the street without knowing their masks, and tiny domestic episodes rearranged themselves with new context, recipes exchanged, birthday cards signed, an awkward offer to water our plants during a holiday. These gestures of neighborliness that had always made me feel warm now felt like the lubricants of a machine built to hide them. I could have picked a dozen mornings to break any of the small humiliations cataloged into a single explosion. But there is, if you are honest about it, a particular efficiency to being made small in front of people who think they are being kind. And that is precisely what happened one Tuesday in late autumn, when the city still remembered the hum of summer and the office smelled faintly of coffee and urgency. I had not meant to go there that day, but the world conspires in petty ways, and my mother's package had not left the post office as promised, and I found myself clutching a reissued tracking code and telling myself I would drop it off at her workplace if the line at the counter was long, which meant I would be standing in the lobby of the very floor that had become a geography of secrets. And when the security guard glanced at my ID and made a small joke about the weather, I smiled with the same politeness anyone uses to keep the small talk machine functioning, but already my eyes were scanning for the faces on the diary page. The reception area looked nothing like the glossy office photos my wife sometimes sent me of catered lunches and team-building events. It felt lived in and deliberate, a place where the posture of everyone waiting was rehearsed for trustworthiness. And when I asked the woman at the desk through the glass if someone from her team might help me with a package, she smiled the way people smile at patrons who make an effort to be polite. And then she said, in a voice that held a practiced warmth and a hint of apology, "I'm sorry, sir, everyone's in meetings right now, but light us a call, and we'll see what we can do." And there was a hesitance just under the syllables, like someone who has been coached in how to sound helpful when the truth of helpfulness is a liability. I did something I had never done before because the situation had stripped me of the usual filters. Rather than calling the number she gave me, I asked directly, with more candor and less shame than I had any right to feel, whether she could tell me which conference room might have the vendor meeting running long. And the receptionist, whose name I had seen in my wife's handwriting, cocked her head and said, in a cadence that sounded almost like a confession disguised as convenience, "It's the third door on the right if you go down the corridor, but they tend to lock it when they're on vendor calls because of confidentiality, because we've had people dropping in unannounced before." And something in the way she emphasized the word confidentiality landed like a fist on my sternum. I followed the corridor because my curiosity had shifted into a force with its own gravity, and clipped nameplates passed by in a rhythm until I reached a door with a frosted glass pane and a sign that read in tasteful font the name of her team leader, and I paused because the air felt different there, as if the building was holding its breath. And then the door opened a sliver, and through the crack I heard a laugh that was all too familiar and a voice that had the quiet intimacy of someone describing something precious to someone else who had no right to care about it except that they had decided to share ownership of it. I do not have a talent for eavesdropping, and I have never desired to be the man who hides behind doors and counts syllables, but I pressed my ear to the wood, and the world arranged itself into the most ordinary of scenes. An office meeting about deliverables, voices rising and falling in the safe, corporate choreography of teamwork. And then the boss spoke with a warmth that was a shade too indulgent and a phrase that was not meant to be overheard by anyone who did not believe themselves to be part of the inner circle, and he said, with a slow, satisfied cadence that made my blood run cold because the intimacy of his tone belonged to the sentences I had read in the diary. She handled the vendor escalation yesterday in exactly the way I wanted her to, and she's been doing a lot for us lately, you know? And everyone's helped cover for her when needed because she's valuable to the team, and it would be a shame to lose people over personal matters. And besides, it keeps things smooth for the quarter if we can all put petty things aside. And in that single breath, the phrase cover for her when needed articulated the mechanism that had been feeding them and also made me a thing to be managed. A junior staffer, in a voice that tried to sound casual but revealed the high wire of loyalty, laughed and added, "Yeah. We've rearranged schedules a couple of times. Nothing major, just a little give and take when someone needs time, and she always pays it forward with extra work or by owning the messy tasks." And another voice, older and soft, said, "We're a family here. We look out for our own." And the way they said the word family was an act of protection and exclusion at once. I pressed my hand so hard to the door that my knuckles burned, and the hallway smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and unresolved things. And I thought of every time I had been kind to the people who now declared themselves kin, and the sense of being bankrupt in the currency of trust made me dizzy. What happened next was not cinematic. There was no knife glare, no slamming door that would have pleased an audience, only the banal cruelty of being sized up in a world you thought belonged to you and being found obsolete. And when a voice that I knew belonged to her, soft, apologetic, the way she used to be when she wanted to soften an accusation into forgiveness, said, "I'm sorry about the timing. I didn't mean for any of you to have to cover me. I should have told you, but Em said it was better this way, and I trust his call." And the boss replied with a casual possessiveness that made my teeth ache. "It's fine. We'll handle the logistics. That's what a team does. We know how to be discreet when something complicated is going on, and she's been instrumental lately, so I'm not worried about anything." The sentence landed like a verdict. The junior who had laughed earlier turned and, with a smile that was too bright for the words, said, "We like it when things run smoothly, and she keeps things smooth. Don't we all prefer fewer disruptions, especially when the quarter's tight?" And in that grouping of cooperative sentences I heard the tremor of condescension, as if they were speaking about a household appliance that occasionally needed recalibration and whose inconveniences were to be tolerated because the device otherwise performed well. At that point, a man from facilities, who had once helped us move a shelf in our apartment and who had eaten leftover pie at our table at Thanksgiving, leaned back in his chair and said, "We all pitch in when it keeps the leadership stable." And I felt something split cleanly in my chest because it was not only betrayal anymore. It was a networked, structural kindness that had been weaponized to anesthetize responsibility. There was a moment, one of those small, absurd pauses life sometimes hands you where everything you have ever believed and everything you have ever been collapses into a single, undeniable fact, where I could have retreated, where I could have walked away with the dignity of a man who refused to be a spectacle. But the world had shifted me into a different economy, and I realized that dignity without action would feel like a polite way of being erased. And so I left the corridor as quietly as I had entered, my shoes whispering on the polished floor. And when a passing secretary offered me a sympathetic, rehearsed smile as if they could smell my defeat, I returned it with a politeness that masked the cyclone under the skin and said, in a tone that was measured and steady and not at all like the voice of the man who had been tripping over suspicion for days, "No worries. I just needed to drop this off. Thank you." and walked out into an afternoon that felt like glass under my feet. The decision did not arrive as a shout or a cinematic moment of revelation. It arrived as a cold, granular certainty that had the weight of something unarguable. And by the time I sat on a wet bench outside the building watching people come and go like actors who had practiced moving through stages for years, I understood with a clarity that was almost clinical that I could not continue to be a background fixture in an exhibit that had been curated without my consent. I understood, with the calm focus of someone who has measured the distance of a fall and chosen the better way to fall deliberately rather than being pushed, that I would not allow them the comfort of thinking this was a private matter between two people, because the way they had arranged themselves around this deception had made them complicit, and the appropriate response to complicity is not melodrama but consequence. And in that small, surgical thought, there was a pivot from grief into something else, cold, patient, and inexorable. And once it took hold, I knew I had crossed the line into a place where retreat was impossible, and revenge had begun to be not a promise, but an operational fact. The plan did not arrive fully formed like a thunderclap, but like a long, precise drawing. A blueprint that needed measured lines, faint pencil marks, and the patience to erase what did not fit. I told myself, again and again, that revenge is a craft and not a tantrum. And because I had decided I would not give them the spectacle they so desperately wanted, I sat down at the kitchen table with a notebook and began to write with a hand that did not shake. And the first rule I wrote was this: do not do anything illegal. Do not let fury make you reckless. And treat the system that protected them as if it were the enemy's Achilles heel, slowly, patiently, and exposed at the joints. I could have burned the place down in 1,000 vulgar ways, but I wanted something that would hurt in the rooms where they felt safest: their careers, their reputations, and the administrative soft underbelly of a company that had convinced itself that we're family was permission to conspire. The second rule I wrote beneath the first was to stay present in our life, but colder, to perform a kind of pale normalcy, so she would not suspect that anything had shifted into operational mode. I would be present at dinners. I would answer her texts with the same dry humor I always used. I would laugh at a joke she told if it did not leave me feeling hollow. And I would return to work each morning with a face that suggested nothing but a man mildly amused by office stories, because the best traps are baited with comfort. The third rule, etched a little more firmly, was to gather what they had already given me: names, dates, hotel codes, the list of restaurants, petty logistical annotations in her handwriting that tied people to actions. These things were not theater props. They were mapped clues, and if I treated them as evidence instead of insults, I could begin to assemble a case that a compliance officer, an HR director, or a laterally ethical lawyer would not be able to shrug off. I began by cataloging everything I already had in the way a prosecutor compiles witness statements, except I was not a lawyer, and the goal was not to put anyone in a cell, but to make the corporate ecosystem that had enabled this affair unbearable for the people who had chosen complicity. The diary got photographed and stored in several places, so a single accident could not erase it. But I didn't fling the images into the internet for the vulgar thrill of exposure, because that would be a child's hammer swing instead of a surgeon's incision. I copied down the names she mentioned and the small annotations about who ran interference and who liked things smooth this quarter. And I cross-checked those names with LinkedIn profiles, with the corporate directory I could access, with the bylines of memos I had casually seen on the coffee table, and with public social media, where people sometimes, in their vanity or boredom, left footprints of truth. I visited the hotel lobby she had circled only as far as a legitimate public space would allow, and took notes on the signage and the times the concierge shifted, because if the building's security logs would later be requested by the right people, it would matter whether the dates she had written matched the footprint of a guest in their system. I did not break into anything. I did not hack doors or force servers. I simply looked, documented, and remembered the way things had been written in ink, and typed in the digital places they used to show off their best faces. I printed out my bank statements for the periods around the dates in the diary, so I could see whether any corporate expense charges, vendor invoices, or hotel bookings correlated with the entries. Again, not because I imagined forging anything, but because a pattern of reimbursements or suspicious vendor charges would be a lever when I finally knocked on the right office door. At night, I would sit with that stack of paper and a cup of tea that had gone cold and read through each line the way a man might read a map to know which routes were safe to travel and which were mine. People underestimate the power of putting small annoyances into language that an institution understands, and so I rehearsed conversations that sounded like civility but landed as pressure. I imagined speaking to HR and saying, "I have a set of dates and names and potential policy breaches that I would like you to review confidentially." And I imagined the HR person leaning forward with a pen and a file and hearing something in my tone that told them this was not a fishing expedition, but an organized, documented concern. I built a timeline that chained diary entries to overheard conversations to receipts to the one photo of her receiving a package from a courier on a date she had said that she was in a meeting, and I converted those coincidences into a linear record so that each piece buttressed the next. The idea was to create a story that could not be shrugged off as the messy collateral of private life, because it showed systemic support for deception that directly implicated company resources and behavior. While doing so, I also quietly explored the company's reporting mechanisms because every corporation that takes money from public clients pretends to value compliance, and I knew there were channels, anonymous hotlines, vendor fraud lines, external auditors, that could be fed with carefully worded facts rather than theatrical accusations. And the beauty of this approach is that an institution's own rules become the scalpel that cuts it when used correctly. I planned to present the facts in a way that mirrored their language: policy breach, conflict of interest, misuse of company time, unauthorized scheduling, and possible expense account irregularities. And in doing so, I would force the company to apply its sterile, bureaucratic machinery to a problem it had preferred to treat as a domestic mess. I also recognized something crucial in my notes that night, which was that if I wanted to remove her safety net, I had to find people who were not pure allies. People who had been quietly harmed, who had seen the favoritism and resented it, or who had professional obligations that would make them amenable to truth-telling if it were delivered with clarity and without revengeous theatrics. I reached out, in my carefully preserved normality, to one person I had once considered a friend in the building, a mid-level manager who was always polite to our faces but found reasons to avoid line-of-sight interactions at meetings. I asked him for coffee under some trivial pretext about logistics and watched his shoulders relax when the first minutes were mundane. Then, after we had exchanged the ritual small talk that lubricates these interactions, I said, with nothing but blunt calm, "Have you ever noticed anything off about how scheduling changes happen on my wife's team?" And I watched him flee the question like someone who has been carrying a sharp pebble in their shoe and is not yet ready to set it down. But by the end of the conversation, he admitted in a voice that was half shame and half relief that there had been times when he had been asked to cover for someone and that it had not felt right, that he had sometimes been told not to look too closely because the boss wanted to avoid distractions. And he offered, almost before I dared to ask, that he would be willing to answer questions if the right people came knocking because he did not want to be on the side of having hidden something for convenience. It was imperfect and messy and human, which is to say it was exactly what I needed because revenge that relies on robots does not cut the same way as revenge that exposes human choices. While my network of reluctant witnesses convened in the background, I prepared the practical means to make the company listen. A concise packet with the diary photos, the timeline, the correlated bank entries and receipts, and a short, unemotional cover letter addressed to the head of compliance and copied to the legal department and the external audit line that the company advertised for vendor complaints. I had the packet printed at a neutral location so there would be no digital trail that looked like a dramatic smear campaign, and I wrapped it in a plain envelope with a note that read, in language that was careful and strategically provocative, "For your confidential review. Potential misuse of company resources and internal policy breaches. Please acknowledge receipt." I would deliver one copy in person, with the posture of a man who was only asking for the rules to be applied, and I would place another via the anonymous hotline in a way that ensured the organization's own mechanisms would trigger an internal review rather than letting gossip wander like a rumor that dies without consequence. In parallel, I quietly contacted an employment lawyer under the pretext of asking general questions about workplace policies because I wanted to know how a complaint might be escalated, what documentation was most persuasive, and whether any protections existed for someone who chose to remain in the marriage while seeking accountability through institutional means. The lawyer gave me procedural steps in a tone that was both legal and clinical and told me what records would be most compelling. Dates, corroboration, financial anomalies, and I adjusted my packet to be forensic enough to pass the smell test of a person trained to sniff out theatrics. By the time the packet was ready and my allies had murmured their willingness to support a formal review, I had learned to sleep in the bed of a man who had not surrendered to fury, but who also had not let the wound scar by itself. I had become a kind of slow-moving engine, predictable to those who watched me, but quiet in my motions. And that patience was part of the strategy, because people who have protected themselves with smiles often make the fatal mistake of believing nothing will ever challenge the narrative they have carefully curated. I did not want to humiliate them in the gutter. I wanted their world to realign so sharply around fact and policy that the comfortable protective mechanism they had built, favoritism, coordinated scheduling, small conspiracies spoken in the tone of family, no longer functioned. The plan was not vengeful theater. It was structural correction dressed in the sober clothes of paperwork, witness statements, and process, and I like to imagine the moment when their polite phrases would be read back to them in an HR meeting that had the antiseptic buzz of fluorescent lights and the presence of someone who could suspend their pay or reassign their projects. The last note I wrote in that notebook before I put it away in a drawer where it could not be easily found by a curious hand said simply, in letters that did not tremble anymore, "Patience is a weapon, and truth is a force multiplier. Be steady, be boring, be relentless." I carried the envelope like a small, ordinary thing because ordinary objects travel through extraordinary moments with less suspicion, and that was part of the point. I did not want anyone to look at the way my hand trembled because the tremor would have given the whole scene away and made my movement into a performance rather than an act of procedure. I walked into the building at 9:30 on a gray Wednesday with the rain peeling from my coat and the packet folded flat inside a briefcase, and the receptionist, who had once smiled with the complacency of someone inside a warm scheme, glanced up and greeted me with the same practiced helpfulness and then, when I signed in, asked if I wanted coffee while I waited and offered me a chair where I could see the elevators. Because civility is the first line of defense for people who think form can substitute for truth. I waited until a lull in the foot traffic, took the envelope from the briefcase, and walked it over to the compliance office with the posture of a man who had stepped out to hand in a tax form and not the posture of someone delivering a verdict. When I knocked, the woman who answered introduced herself in a tone that was exactly the blend of firmness and discretion I had anticipated, and I said, as if reading from a script I had written to be unreadable as passion, "I have a confidential concern regarding potential misuse of company time and resources tied to personnel in your division, and I have compiled documented evidence I would like you to review in confidence." And she smiled the way professionals smile when they have heard that before, but have not yet seen the file that makes a difference. And she gestured for me to sit and offered a cup of coffee that I accepted because rituals calm people into listening. She asked me to outline the nature of my concern, and I did not launch into blame or melodrama, because I had learned that institutions recoil from emotion but respond to pattern. So I spoke plainly and with the kind of measured cadence that makes someone lean forward to take notes. And I said, "It appears there has been a pattern of internal scheduling adjustments and informal cover arrangements that coincide with dates I have documented in personal entries and with vendor bookings that do not align with our stated policies. And I have photographs, timestamps, receipts, and names that correlate with these anomalies. And because this behavior appears to use company resources in a way that may contravene policy, I want this reviewed confidentially by compliance. I do not wish to call anyone out in public, but I need it to be investigated through proper channels." She read the cover letter twice, placed it on the desk like a thing both ordinary and incendiary, and said in a voice that suggested the Bureau would marshal itself into action, "We take matters like this seriously. Please leave your contact information, and we will initiate a confidential review and may need to reach out for follow-up." I watched the little machine of corporate response crank into motion with a satisfaction that was cleaner than revenge, as spectacle, and more thorough than any angry outburst could ever be. I left a copy of the packet with compliance, and, because institutional inertia loves symmetry, I also fed the companion information anonymously through the vendor hotline and through an external auditing email that the company advertised for third-party concerns, because I wanted the system to face the data from multiple vectors and to make it harder for local protectors to smother everything with a single defensive narrative. The next 24 hours were a study in bureaucratic ticking, an automated email confirming receipt, a phone call from the compliance office clarifying a date, another from external audit asking for the bank statements I had referenced in the packet, and then the slow, lethal efficiency of people who do not care that your life has been rearranged. They care about process, documentation, and the appearance of due diligence. And those cares aligned perfectly with what I had done because I had turned a messy private betrayal into an institutional problem that required institutional solutions. I watched from the edges as the company, obliged by policy and by the risk of external liability, opened channels it would have preferred to keep closed. And in doing so, it pulled people into rooms where the air was fluorescent and honest in a way their water cooler confessions never had been. The first outward ripple hit within 48 hours in a way I could not have arranged with 1,000 screaming confrontations. The boss, who had once been a man of easy charm and territorial comfort, was pulled into a meeting with the head of HR and a compliance officer, whose faces were calm and whose pens moved with the brisk detachment of people trained to neutralize problems before they became liabilities. And in the background, the junior staffers who had once laughed in his orbit were directed to give written statements to a neutral investigator who had arrived from another office, precisely because internal neutrality is the currency companies pay when their public face could be damaged. I felt a mixture of cold vindication and a guilty, small pang, because there are always human beings in procedural machinery. But I had chosen the path that caused the least theatrical suffering and the most structural consequence, and the difference mattered to me. I had anticipated attempts at damage control, the boss reaching out to people with comforting words, offering coffees, making thin jokes in casual corridors, and all of that happened, predictable as weather, but the machine I had engaged was not swayed by charm or coffee. It wanted records. What I did not expect, and what hit me harder than I thought it would, was watching my wife when the first formal email from compliance asked for clarification about certain dates and asked whether she would be willing to cooperate with the review. I had rehearsed her reaction: defensive, tearful, evasive, and indeed, when she read the terse corporate language, her fingers tightened on the screen and she asked, in a voice trying to sound fragile and reasonable at the same time, "What does this mean? Did someone just file a complaint?" And I said, with a coldness I had been cultivating for a month, "Someone asked them to look into the calendar, and they will follow their own process." And I remember the little catch in her breath as if it had been a physical strike, because she understood that the protective cobweb she and her little team had woven was being tugged at in a way her boss could not smooth with a wink or an expense report. She tried to speak to him directly, and to her credit, she did not beg publicly. She sent a message that read like a plea wrapped in pragmatism, an offer to clear up any scheduling confusion, an explanation of odd vendor timings, and an emphasis on her devotion to the work, and it landed in a corporate inbox where statements are not forgiven by the virtue of sentiment, but measured against policies and logs. They tried to fix it, of course, because organizations reflexively look for ways to contain breaches that threaten their image, and the boss went into mitigation mode in the most institutional fashion possible. He sent an email to the team thanking everyone for their efforts and reminding them of the importance of transparent scheduling. He asked his assistant to collate meeting invites and to ensure calendars matched room bookings, and he reached out to HR to volunteer to be fully cooperative with the review while simultaneously asking for discretion because he had family to consider and reputations built on years of service that he said were being imperiled by what he suggested might be misinterpretation. None of the mitigation could rewrite the records that had already been created: vendors who confirmed dates, reception logs that showed guest entries, bank statements showing charges that matched hotel bookings, and the compliance officer asked for copies of meeting room reservations and access logs from the facilities team, which was the hinge I had known would open things up because access logs are not subject to polite loyalty the way smiling colleagues are. Once the facilities team acknowledged that key swipes and guest logs would be checked, a quiet scramble began that had the unpleasant honesty of things being tidied when a house has been found with a stain that must be explained publicly. There were conversations in corners and text messages that tried to reframe the facts as misunderstandings, but the process had teeth. The junior staffer who had once laughed too loudly at our holiday small talk sat across from an investigator with a recorder on the table and described, in halting sentences that still tried to protect, how schedules had been shifted for business reasons and how people had been asked to cover when it was convenient for leadership. The facilities manager reluctantly supplied access logs that showed unusual entries in conference rooms on dates that lined up with diary entries I had photographed, and the external auditor sent a curt request for copies of receipts and expense reports that matched hotel charges. And when accounting finally cross-checked vendor payments, they found a set of small, irregular reimbursements that did not align with approved vendor lists, but did align suspiciously with dates our private diary had noted. When HR called my wife in for a formal meeting, she sat across from them with a face that oscillated between outrage and pleaded confusion and said, in a voice that tried to sound wounded and reasonable at once, "I did not mean for it to become this. I thought we were handling things responsibly. I thought the team knew how to be discreet, and the HR lead, whose job is to be both a mirror and a blade in bureaucratic wardrobes, thanked her for cooperating and explained the process in a neutral tone that let no room for theatrics. They would investigate, collect statements, and determine whether policy breaches had occurred, and if they had, appropriate measures would follow. There was, in the middle of all this carefully executed procedure, a small theater of human panic and petty cruelty. The boss tried to charm people into silence, saying things in corridors that sounded almost like apologies while seeking private assurances that this won't become a career problem if we handle it, and offering mitigations like public reassurances of commitment and promises to take responsibility. And others began to distance themselves in the protective way people distance themselves from sinking ships, offering statements that were technical and professional and devoid of the earlier joviality. My wife texted me at midnight under the cover of the ordinary pillow talk we used to trade and said, in a string of messages that tried to shape an alternate narrative, "This is a nightmare. I will explain everything tomorrow. They have no idea." And I replied with the same measured restraint I had cultivated. "Do what you have to do. Cooperate. They will follow their process." And I felt neither triumph nor easy satisfaction in that moment, but rather a careful, terrible relief that the mechanism I had engaged was procedural and would not be satisfied by theatrics. The execution of the plan felt like watching a lever you had placed in motion reach the fulcrum, slow at first, then inexorable, and the immediate consequences were not the melodramatic ones I had sometimes fantasized about in darker moments, but administrative and surgical. Access restricted, calendars audited, expense entries probed, reassignment conversations started. And in those antiseptic moves, their power began to recede into the categories that corporate life fears most, because those categories have consequences that ripple into raises, promotions, and reputations. What the staff could not fix with laughs and cover stories was being handled the way companies handle liability, through processes, through records, and through decisions made by people who are not interested in private consolations. I had not wanted to humiliate anyone in the street. I had wanted their world to function under a new arithmetic where choices had costs, and the immediate execution of the plan proved that a carefully applied bureaucratic pressure can be both merciless and, in a strange way, clean. By the time the first formal notice went out that an internal review had been opened and that certain employees would be temporarily reassigned pending its outcome, I sat at our kitchen table looking at the rainslide marks on the window and felt the small, taut satisfaction of a mechanism that works as intended, while also feeling the peculiar human ache that follows any action that changes people's lives and livelihoods, because consequences, however deserved, are still consequences. They told me, with the kind of corporate politeness that dresses bad news in beige, that the review had concluded and that certain actions would follow. When the email came, it read like a legal epistle written to protect an institution more than to comfort the wounded, and I sat with the message open on my laptop while the apartment hummed around me and tried to let the words mean exactly what they said. The boss had been placed on immediate administrative leave pending an external probe and would not be representing the company at client meetings, they wrote, and several individuals had been reassigned to different teams while HR completed individual interviews to determine culpability and next steps, and the finance department had been asked to review expense reimbursements going back a year. The language was carefully neutral, no indictments, no theatrical condemnations. But in the days that followed, the neutral language turned into the familiar, brutal arithmetic of consequence because policies are not flexible to the taste of apology and access logs. Expense reports and witness statements are stubborn things that do not soften when someone begs for mercy. Within a week, the boss resigned, citing personal reasons, and his resignation letter, which was written with the practiced dignity of someone who knew how to shape a narrative even in exit, used phrases like unforeseen circumstances and regret and respect for due process. And yet the local press that covers corporate shifts smelled an opening and wrote pieces quoting anonymous sources about leadership changes and the need for greater transparency, and the people who had once smiled across our holiday table began to distance themselves in ways that looked like survival rather than conviction. Some of them deleted photos from social media with a kind of furtive haste that made me feel simultaneously satisfied and sad, because human beings always try to erase the evidence of things that make them uncomfortable instead of learning from them. And that small deletion felt like both punishment and cowardice. She was called into formal interviews by HR more than once, and I sat in the kitchen and imagined the way she must fold her hands in front of a woman with an external investigator and try to make private decisions sound like policy errors and not moral failures. And when she came home the first night after being asked to provide written statements, she sat at the table and did not meet my eyes, and she said, in a voice that was all the things I had heard before, but now rearranged into apology and bargaining, I will tell them everything they want. I will explain the scheduling. I will show them the vendor notes. I will tell them I asked people to help because it was simpler, because we were in a crunch, because I didn't want to lose the client, because and she paused in the kind of breathless stall that is meant to solicit forgiveness, and I said, as gently as I could manage, though gentleness felt like another language I had to learn again. You already told them what mattered when you wrote it down, and then you asked people to cover for you, and that is what they are looking at. If your explanation is true, then the process will find it, and if it is not, the process will do its work. She pressed her palms flat on the table and looked as if she was trying to press herself back into shape, like someone attempting to fold a letter along old creases so the text will read right again. And the thing I remember most from that evening was her asking, in a voice that had the tinny quality of someone speaking from within a storm, "Do you hate me?" And my answer was not a sermon or a moralizing lecture, because the moment did not feel like the place for that. It was simply a small, tired truth. I am not sure how to feel about you right now, but I am certain I don't want to be the man who watches his life be rearranged without a chance to respond. She wept then, but not with the cathartic sobbing of a woman suddenly repentant and changed. She wept with a raw, furious grief for opportunities lost and for a life that had altered in ways she had not fully foreseen. And that grief was its own punishment, because they had once been joined in shared nights and small kindnesses, and now the same memories served as evidence in a file. The company's final steps were not theatrical. They were administrative and precise in ways that demonstrate how modern institutions punish and yet maintain a veneer of fairness. The external audit found several instances of expense coding that fell outside vendor agreements, and while it did not, by its own careful thresholds, label every irregularity as intentional fraud, it recommended policy remediation, some staff training, and in 2 cases, termination for cause where the evidence crossed a clear line. A handful of people left the company under the umbrella of mutual separation agreements. Others were quietly moved to areas where their influence would be limited, and staff morale went through the kind of recalibration that follows when a cohesive narrative, family, loyalty, mutual backscratching, reveals its seams and finds itself threadbare. I watched colleagues I had known as friendly acquaintances suddenly avoid eye contact or send carefully neutral messages, and I measured these social amputations like wind removing leaves, necessary in the way winter is necessary, and merciless in the way it reveals what was superficial in the foliage. There was a small, private satisfaction as these adjustments took place because the system had been used as the instrument of consequence and not spectacle. But that satisfaction was threaded through with the knowledge that jobs were lost and reputations bruised, and that my action, however necessary in my mind, had not been costless. There were people who reached out to me during the days that followed with different flavors of awkwardness. Some offered quiet support, saying they had suspected imbalances for a long time and were relieved to see that accountability was finally happening, while others expressed discomfort and asked me quietly whether the process had felt like something I wanted. And I answered each person honestly in a tone that mirrored the complexity of the truth. I wanted the truth documented and addressed. I did not enjoy watching people scramble. The mid-level manager who had confessed to me in coffee agreed to speak with the investigator and later told me he felt a strange unburdening once he had given an account that stopped him from being an accessory to impropriety. And in his voice there was relief, but also regret that he had not said something earlier, because fear of rocking the boat had seemed rational when one's livelihood is at stake. That regret is its own kind of cost because it suggests how often systems are preserved by incremental complicity and how easy it is to be quiet until the cost becomes personal. Our lives did not collapse into cinematic scenes of revenge and redemption. They rearranged into a new, quieter architecture that required repairs neither of which of us initially knew how to make. She was suspended for a short period while the HR process considered the extent of her involvement and offered her the option of voluntary resignation, which she did not accept immediately because we still had complicated joint obligations and because some sense in her suggested there might be a path to preservation if the process allowed it. And I sat with the ambiguity of that choice because part of me wanted to punish, and part of me wanted the scaffolding of the life we had built to remain, standing if it could be rebuilt honestly. We began to speak, haltingly, in a way that was more like negotiation than intimacy. We discussed who would handle certain bills, how to inform our families, and whether we should see a mediator or a counselor, because the legal and financial scaffolding of a relationship is not the same as the emotional scaffolding, and both needed attention. She asked me, on a wet Tuesday, whether I wanted to separate, and I told her that I did not have a clean answer because I had gone through a kind of transformation that made clarity rare, and in that ambivalence there was a freedom that was also a burden. I could choose to make decisions based on righteousness and retribution, or I could choose to use the pause to imagine what a life rebuilt on fewer illusions might look like. And both choices felt plausible and grievous. There were smaller consequences I had not fully imagined when I set the mechanism in motion. Mutual acquaintances taking sides in ways that felt like a small civil war at neighborhood barbecues, my mother asking questions in tones that betrayed a desire for simple answers I could not give, and the evenings being emptier because the presence that had once been a default companion was now someone whose trust one did not yet know how to rebuild or dismantle without cruelty. I found, in the solitary hours, that revenge achieved is not an ecstatic trumpet but a measured bell that tolls and then leaves a silence. The pleasure is not in watching people burn so much as in restoring a sense of agency to a life that had been passive, and that restoration is populated by the weirdly mundane rituals of reordering finances, talking to lawyers about separation of assets, and making sure the cat is fed when both of you forget births and deadlines and small kindnesses. At the end of those months, when the dust had settled into its new landscape and the company had implemented policy changes and the people directly responsible had either left or been reassigned, I sat one evening with a notebook again, because paper is how I make sense of things, and wrote 5 lines that distilled what I had learned without sermonizing. Truth, when weaponized into bureaucracy, is quieter than spectacle but more effective. Patience is not passivity but a decision to be precise. People will choose comfort unless confronted with a cost. Consequences ripple beyond perpetrators into collateral lives. And lastly, the thing I had wanted most was not to be cruel, but to be seen. I taped that scrap into the notebook to remind myself why I had done it, and I slept that night with a tiredness that felt finally like the end of a task, and not like the residue of rage. I was not unscarred and I was not whole, but there was a measure of relief in the paper trail I had left behind because, for the first time since the diary had slid from the drawer, I felt like I had reclaimed at least the grammar of my life. I could speak when wronged, I could use systems for redress, and I could survive the cost. The revenge had been implemented as carefully as I had drawn the lines on that first page of the plan, and the satisfaction I felt was not the triumphant roar scenes in movies sell you, but a quieter, sharper knowledge that when people construct a web to hide a betrayal, you can either be caught in it forever or you can learn how to map it and step out.